is to think about the social conditions in the world that enable a disaster or the consequences of a disaster. So here we have to think, in this case, about the virus itself. This is one of the nicer, more attractive models, representations of the virus. We're all familiar with this kind of image. I mean, it's debatable whether a virus is alive or not, but this one certainly has the capacity to reproduce and multiply itself on a vast scale. And it is quite striking that the vector, the means this virus has to reproduce itself and to multiply its presence in the world is human social interaction. That is the business of sociologists. We are studying, if you like, the means that this non-human entity has for multiplying and, of course, impacting human populations. So it's now familiar in sociological commentaries on the pandemic that there are distinct preconditions in recent human history that have enabled the virus to follow its reproductive strategy. For instance, the development on a very large scale of rapid transnational human travel, especially by air, so that there are now millions of, or have been, at least until the start of the pandemic, there were millions of international flights occurring each year, which provided pathways for the virus. And then in terms of the means that were available for public health institutions and authorities to combat and stop the spread of the virus, these too have changed in recent history with the global uptake of neoliberal ideas, the vast privatization and corporatization of governments, the decline of public service mechanisms, privatization of health, decline of public education institutions. These also have made, in a more indirect way, the large-scale impact of the epidemic possible. And of course, there's another very familiar dimension of these changes, the increased economic inequality in most countries in the world associated with the shift towards market ideology and the privatization of public services, the growth of precarity among large parts of populations in most economies now, has also created conditions for the epidemic to develop in the way that it has. So we've seen as the virus took hold, a massively greater impact on groups who are poor or marginalized in social terms. I remember back in May checking the vaccination rates globally, and at that point, I don't think that this has changed very much since. If you classified the richest group of countries, they had an average vaccination rate at that point of 30% of the population. If you classified the poorest countries, they had a vaccination rate of about 1%. Quite dramatic differences in the mechanism of prevention of severe illness and therefore of death, in the pandemic. And that is still the case. In my country, for instance, Australia, a settler colonial country, marginal in the world system, yet a very prosperous country in the far south. The vaccination rates of Indigenous people, who are the poorest community in the country, are dramatically lower than the vaccination rates for the Anglo dominant population. And when we look into the conditions of life of marginalised and precarious workers, it's not hard to see how this might be. Here, for instance, there's a picture that I took a few years ago of migrant workers in Hong Kong, before, of course, the recent Chinese regime's takeover of the city. At that point, a large proportion of the domestic workers in Hong Kong were migrant workers, overwhelmingly women, especially from the Filipinos. And this is a picture of their only organised form of recreation on their day off, or their half day off, gathering for social events in one of the public spaces of the city, underneath an overpass. And you can see, the conditions for the spread of an airborne virus in a context like that, very simply in a particularly economically and physically vulnerable population. And, one could make the same point in many other parts of the world. So in ways that we are very familiar with as sociologists, the epidemic has been shaped by the conditions that allowed its spread and shaped the character and impact of preventive and restorative medical measures in response. Now, we could call this, and it is perhaps most familiar to sociologists, to think of such an issue as embodied injustice, as a social injustice experienced in the body, felt physically, and with, in this case, for many people, very severe impact on the body. But I think we have to go beyond this too. We have to go beyond the simple mapping of social inequalities in relation to health, and in this case, a health crisis, to think about the social practices that produce those conditions. And here I think it's very helpful to use a concept developed particularly by Ashia Mbembe, now working in South Africa, though originally from Central Africa. I'm sure many people in RC54 are familiar with Mbembe's work on race, his work on the critique of Black reason, for instance, a dramatic and impressive book. But what I have in mind particularly is his influential paper on necropolitics, where he thinks about the shape of political processes that whose stake is life and death, is the most severe possible impact on the body. And he sketches, a number of forms of what he calls necropolitics. And I think that is a very useful way to think about the impact of this pandemic. It is essentially a political choice by corporations, by governments, by mass media controllers, for instance, to prioritize intellectual property rights and thus the profits of drug companies and the biomedical industrial complex that's associated with the drug companies against the interests of the poor and marginalized across the world, as embodied, for instance, in the COVAX agreement, which set up a mechanism for the distribution of vaccines to the poorer countries, but which has never contested intellectual property rights. It has never been a possible policy of the most powerful countries in the world to waive intellectual property rights in vaccines for this virus or this set of strains of viruses, and set up mechanisms for the public production of vaccines worldwide. That has never been a practical proposition, and I think it's a dramatic example of the institutional necropolitics here, which in effect decides which bodies will die and which are most likely to survive with the spread of this particular virus. Now the character of the necropolitics involved, I think, becomes very clear when we think about the gendered character of the pandemic. So I want to spend a few minutes reflecting on some of the gender features of the COVID pandemic. And here I think it's important to take a sociological view of gender, which is not necessarily the most popular way of theorizing gender, but is, I think, basic to understanding the social consequences. And one of the key features of a sociological view, a point which is made by many sociologists, by myself in my theoretical work on gender, by Teresita de Barbieri in her impressive work on theorizing gender, by Sylvia Walby in Britain, and by other colleagues in Europe. The key point that is made by all of these theorists, or a key point, is that gender is socially multidimensional. There are different dimensions, substructures, if you like, of gender relations and the gender order. There is, for instance, a structure of gendered economic relationships, a system of production and consumption, in which the gendering of care work is a very important part. And it is notable, and it has been noticed from the beginning of the international epidemic last year, that the workforce in care work related to the epidemic is quite strongly gendered. Women form something like 70% of the health care workforce that is involved in responding to the epidemic. Women are also, and this is a broad feature globally, are principally responsible for the informal care that occurs in households, given the gender division of labour in domestic labour, one of the very familiar features of the sociology of gender. It's also the case that the power dimension of gender relations is visible in the pandemic, not in itself a driver of the epidemic, except in the political institutions I'll speak about in a moment, but the power relations of domestic gender relations, the power dimension of just domestic gender relations, has also become an issue in the pandemic, with lockdowns and the confinement of people to households, or relative confinement of people to households. The agencies, the non-government organisations and government organisations involved in responding to domestic violence, to gender-based violence in the home, have consistently, from very early in the pandemic, reported a rise in levels of domestic violence, as a larger proportion of the time of the women of the world is spent in close contact with abusive men. A social, unintended, of course, social social consequence of the social and governmental response to the epidemic has been a rise of that familiar form of gender toxicity. For groups not necessarily in household, but who are dealing with gender contradictions in their life, travesties, transgender groups, hijra, and so forth, the structural violence of social marginalisation also becomes an issue in the pandemic, because these groups too have noticeably low levels of vaccination against the virus and access to the better forms of healthcare too. So again, a form of marginalisation within the gender order becomes one of the features of the, if you like, institutional necropolitics of who will live and who will die. Now, those are comments about the situation of women and people involved in gender contradictions. But we also have to pay attention to men and masculinities, which we should always do in analysing gender problems. And here some quite striking features emerge. One is it's a familiar point in the sociology of health. In many parts of the world, not necessarily all, but in many parts of the world, that there are higher levels of what health workers regard as risky behaviour among men or particular groups of men, such as young men, than there are among women or older men. Those issues come out, for instance, in the terrible statistics of road accidents, where the rate of death on the road is something like 4 times as high among young men as it is among young women, and other forms of behaviour that create health risks are also at higher levels among populations of men. Now, here we do, I think, fall into the danger of stereotyping men. It seems to me important to recognise that there is great diversity among men and among forms of masculinity. It's one of the early and really important findings of social research on masculinities. There are different patterns of masculinity, and those different patterns have been shown to be connected with different forms of health-related behaviour and hence risk. One simple example in the COVID epidemic, which I've observed myself in walking around Sydney, is the tendency to wear masks in situations where the virus might be being spread in airborne ways. And just on my observation, I'm sure there is systematic evidence of this somewhere in the literature, but just on my observation, the bulk of people who are walking down the street not wearing masks, when the majority of people do, are actually young men. That may perhaps counteract some of the social conditions that would suggest higher levels of infection among women or marginalised groups. But there is another very important aspect of masculinity, and that is in this pandemic, and that is the forms of masculinity that are associated with dominant forms of political power. It is, I think, striking in relation to this epidemic the extent of, in the powerful states which have actually had the highest burden of infection in this epidemic, there has been, in response to the epidemic, chaotic official policy, a great deal of bluster and gaslighting associated, and in a number of cases, what one can only call a callous indifference to the human cost of the epidemic and its impact on marginalised groups. And I'm speaking here, not about marginal countries, but about the United States, about Brazil, about India, the countries with the highest burden of death in the pandemic. There was literally a chaotic policy situation in the first year of the epidemic. There still is in Brazil and India, and a striking lack of empathy and engagement with the impact on the poor, the marginalised, and the less powerful groups. So, this, when we say this is a social disaster, I mean, the embodiment, the social structure, the social practices, politics of it are deeply and constantly interwoven. I was going to show you here some familiar pictures. I won't dwell on this. You're very familiar with the people involved in this kind of politics. And I'll pass on as quickly as I can. Okay, we now have something like 4.5 million people dead from COVID infection so far in the pandemic. The numbers are still rising, of course. It is an interesting fact that the vulnerability of men to severe effects of the infection seem to be a little higher than the vulnerability of women on the average. There's some debate as to the reasons of that, whether it has to do, given that this is a respiratory disease, with the higher levels of smoking or of other unhealthy practices among populations of men, or whether it is some physiological vulnerability that has not yet been convincingly analysed. But that is something, I guess, that will emerge more as the research goes on. I guess I'm coming now to a moment of theoretical reflection, having sketched some of the politics and some of the social, the familiar social contours. And here I have to, I'm afraid, engage in a little advertising, because what I'm going to say very briefly is set out in rather more detail in the current edition of my little book on the sociology of gender. My argument is basically that in understanding gender, we really have to overcome the familiar nature-nurture dichotomy, the old debate, indeed, which is still bubbling up constantly in right-wing politics, in anti-trans feminist politics, in the politics of reproduction around abortion rights, for instance, and so on. We really have to understand gender practices and gender relations as both social and bodily at the same time, and inextricably so. We have to understand gender as social structure, but as embodied social structure. We have to understand gender, if I can suggest a somewhat paradoxical formula as all about children, as all about human reproduction, as all about reproductive bodies in relation to human history, which is all social. So when I speak of gender, I'm inclined to say we're looking at a process here of social ontoformativity, which I think is a better term than the more popular term of performativity of gender, because I'm borrowing a term here from the Czech philosopher Karel Kozik. In gender processes, and indeed in social processes generally, we are constantly creating through time new social reality. We are actually producing the social as we act socially through time. Now we do that through a form of practice, which I think of as body reflexive practices, in which embodiment is always involved and at stake, and which forms new patterns through time of embodied, in this case, embodied gender. That, it seems to me, is a necessary conceptual background to an adequate way of thinking about gender and gender relations. It doesn't tell us anything about the detail, of course, but it's, if you like, a conceptual orientation that I think is necessary for understanding something like the gender dimensions of the COVID crisis. Now, when I speak of crisis, I'm not meaning just a bad situation, because crisis is, I think, at least to sociologists, has a rather specific meaning. It doesn't just mean something's gone wrong and has to be fixed. It means a situation which can potentially lead to some kind of structural change. It can produce, it has within it the potential for a restructuring of social relations if a collective practice, or if you want to speak Greek, a collective praxis, is possible or is undertaken by social groups who have a degree of agency in the situation. So a crisis, if you like, is a bad situation that could lead somewhere significant socially. And in this case, the practice that may lead somewhere is an embodied practice, given that gender is always an embodied social relationship. So the agency of the body, which has been such a concern of the sociology of the body, is involved, is at stake. Even if the agency of the body is often underplayed in social and cultural analysis of gender, particularly the forms of gender talk, which highlight issues of identity and the fluidity of identities, which has been a very popular way of thinking about gender in recent decades. There's a tendency, I think, in a lot of popular discussion, if you admit the importance of the body and the agency of the body, to think that must always be conservative. This is how conservatives constantly talk, that the reality of gender or sex is the body, and that always leads us back to the old-fashioned notion of a gender dichotomy of the nuclear family, which is actually historically new, as we actually know. And I would argue that it's important for us to recognize that the agency of the body is by no means always conservative. It often leads or points to processes of social change and transformation. The agency of the body also looks to survival, and in this case to our collective survival. It leads to possibilities of pleasure, which can be a radical agenda. It leads to human flourishing, which is often repressed by conservative social forces. So I come finally then to the dynamics of gendered change, having finished my theoretical moment. How do gender relations change, and what is the role of crises such as epidemics and pandemics in the processes of gendered change? Well, we have every reason to recognise that that crises, large-scale crises and disasters such as war can lead to change in gender relations. I was born during the Second World War. I'm a war baby, so I have a certain interest in what happened in the world around the time I was born. And one of the things we're very familiar with, as in the famous picture of Rosie the Riveter in the United States, is massive changes in a gender division of labour that occurred in that particular war as industrial economies re-geared themselves for war production. Very large numbers of women went into the industrial workforce in the combatant countries, and even significant numbers of women went into frontline combat, at least in the case of the Soviet Union. Those changes are historically very familiar, and some of them stuck. If we come forward, say, to the pandemic before this pandemic, the HIV pandemic that started in the 1980s, we see also, though in a different form, a pattern of social response from groups which were severely impacted by the HIV epidemic. In this case, at least in the United States, most dramatically, the key response came from gay communities, where the relevant virus was first identified. The gay communities themselves became policy actors in a way they had never been before. They mobilised to provide care, given that the regime in power in the United States in the 80s was almost totally indifferent. A great deal of community self-help developed, but perhaps more important, the gay communities developed a policy response for prevention and spread it by community organisation, community education. That was the famous safe sex model of sexual relationships in place of the abstinence model, which simply didn't work. But a response which changed sexual practices through public education, informal peer education, publicity, and so forth, which actually proved a really important control mechanism until the antiretroviral chemical therapies became available sometime later. So in those cases, we can see how collective agency became a response to disaster, changing gendered practices, such as sexual practices or industrial labour, in response to the social needs that had emerged. And I think we should be looking at the COVID pandemic In the same way, we should be looking for agents affected by change and possible social means of transformation. And here I think we might think about the care workforce itself, the healthcare workforce itself, and its organizations, whether nurses' unions, professional organizations, non-government care organizations, political organizations. These are potential mobilizing agencies in a collective response to the pandemic that may change some of the gender orders that have proved, aspects of the gender order that have proved toxic in the pandemic. Here I'm drawing on the ideas of someone who may be familiar to many of you. Julieta Kirkwood from Chile, whose work on the history of women's mobilization in Chilean politics developed the concept of the formation of a historical subject as a feature of gender politics. And I think that I mention her work because I think that comes out more clearly in her analysis of gender politics than I have seen it anywhere else. And I think it is useful then to be thinking about, say, the organizations of the care workforce in this epidemic, in terms of their potential to emerge in this kind of role in changing the gender relations implicated in the epidemic. But there is also, of course, a larger possible historical subject that may emerge in response to this pandemic, and which as yet has no social identity. But I think of as the various groups who are partisans for life, for human life and well-being, against the death cults of violence and callousness that have so far been significant in shaping the epidemic. We also need to return to the virus, which is, of course, mutating. It's developing new strains and introducing a great deal of uncertainty into our future in the pandemic. We can, I think we legitimately experience grief for the victims. Our emotional response is legitimate grief and anger, because almost all of these deaths were preventable by adequate public and private action. We can mourn, but we want to turn the mourning to some effect. No one, even the most privileged and protected, no one in this pandemic is safe until the conditions of our social life make all groups safe. That is the bottom line message I take away from my study of the pandemic. And I think it is a task, it's our task of social scientists, with our professional knowledge of the social conditions of life, to spread an understanding of this truth. We're not all in it together, as governments like to say, in the sense that we're all under the same conditions. That is simply not true. But we are all implicated in the safety of all groups. And that is a message we as sociologists should and can take to the world. Thank you.
Dr. Connell, thank you so much. Give you all a virtual appreciation for your remarks. Thank you for setting the table for some discussion for us. Those last remarks really resonate with me. I happen to be head of a boarding school in northern India, and I was just on a large parent meeting this last week because the government has opened access to schools, but being an international boarding school here, one of the things we appeal to before we bring students back is the common good, is that we are not all impacted in the same manner. And of course, our social location in there has a direct bearing on that. And so I particularly, right now in the throes of dealing with some very angry parents who want to have their children back here now and are demanding it. That kind of heartens me for, in a sense, the inclusiveness that we are aiming for in how we approach a very social phenomena.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yes, thank you. I think we had at least one question here in the chat room, and if we can, let's have some discussion. And Dulce, is that sound like a good plan going forward?
Yes, it's a Fabiano, Professor Fabiano David question. Fabiano, do you want to speak your question or?
No, please, you can do it, Dulce.
Okay, 1 minute. Are you fine?
I write better than I talk.
We have two manifestations in our chat. The first of all, Tiago Camargo Iamoto, he said Bolsonaro is the worst president ever. He denied the pandemic and the vaccine. Even advertised medication that is not proven to be effective against COVID-19. He didn't care about social minorities. That's why I am for Bolsonaro. I am too. Congratulations, Connell. Fabiano David's question. Congratulations, Connell. How do you interpret the relationship between the masculinities practices with the administration of the pandemic context and how it affects our bodies?
Okay, let me make a comment particularly about the holders of political power who have been responsible for making of high-level policy. I'm struck by the common ground, if you like, of the leadership of so many of the countries which have been, most severely impacted by the pandemic, showing a particular form of masculinity in the leaders, or at least some common features of masculinities which have become prominent in global politics fairly recently, I think. And they are an authoritarian attitude rather than an attitude of sympathy or empathy with the marginalized. A style of policy making which is attempts to gain prestige by rapid action, a media orientation, so that a barrage of announcements comes forth rather than a reflective policy-making practice. where technical expertise is often rejected or even ridiculed by the political leadership. Now, what I'm saying, you will find in Bolsonaro, you'll also find it in Trump, you'll find it in Johnson, you'll find it to some extent in Modi. And that is a very striking political style, that the right-wing parties should have thrown up leadership of this kind in recent years is a very interesting thing. Now, the political sociologists have an argument that this form of leadership and this drift towards kind of chaotic authoritarianism, to suggest an odd term in the political leadership, is itself a consequence of the longer-term undermining of the public sector, of science, which has been undermined by fossil fuel industries, the tobacco industry, and so forth. And the adoption of corporate models of management in the public sector, which prioritize the entrepreneurial leader, the managerial prerogative, where the man at the top, in Napoleonic vein, declares this shall be done, and expects to get lots of good publicity from taking a strong media-friendly position, regardless of whether that's in the public interest or not. Now that's a plausible argument that this isn't a necessary consequence of the neoliberal turn, but the neoliberal turn has created conditions in politics and the public sector that have been favourable for the emergence of this kind of leadership. And that is a particular form of masculinity. I mean, no prominent political leaders. There are prominent women political leaders, of course, but they do not show this pattern, at least not yet. So I think it's understandable, it's a reasonable thing to think of this as a particular form of political masculinity, which has gained a degree of hegemony over forms of masculinity which are more oriented to technical knowledge, to rational and coherent policy making, which also exists. That form of masculinity also exists in high levels of the state, but has to a significant extent been marginalized, and the consequences in public policy have become dramatically visible in the pandemic. So that's one way I would try to connect an analysis of masculinity with an account of what's been happening here. Bolsonaro, of course, is an example of this. I think there are other reasons why, in his own background and in the political conditions in Brazil, which have produced such a chaotic and disastrous administration there, the level of corruption, the fragmented political structure. There are also conditions for this, but I mean, my heart goes out to friends and colleagues in Brazil who are having to live through this ghastly experience. So, okay, those are my thoughts in response.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jessica, you have your hand up. You want to ask a question?
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Your presentation is very, very good for me. And I have a reflection for this discussion. And in Brazil, the pandemic of the mainly victimize people in situation of extreme social vulnerability, helpless by public policies on access to housing, health, basic sanitation, and drink water, people incarcerated, bestialized, and above all, those bodies and corporality, the gendered, unintelligible, expressing love, sexualities, considered deviant, and for this reason must be and a killing Bambi, subdued to
Yes.
the power of death. The first case in Brazil was a man who worked as janitor, and the second was a housekeeper woman. We have nearly 600.000 pessoas, né? Deaf, and most bodies continue to have very similar social markers of difference.
Yes.
Democracy in Brazil is in erosion, and it all started with paranoid and gender and globalism and cultural Marxism agendas. At this time, while various rulers or groups such as Taliban investing in weapons and propaganda wars, or in demonstrating their military power, they could strive to find solutions regarding the acquisition of vaccines and acceleration of vaccinations in different continents or underdeveloped countries. We are still short of achieving global vaccine coverage, considering that vaccines have to reach every corner of the earth. The defense of intellectual property, advocated by billionaires like Bill Gates and by big pharmaceuticals companies, is obscene. There are localized wars being financed on a daily basis, and we allow everything to be reverted to destruction. This is so bad, because life is most important for the transformation, the things in the world, and wars, weapons, virus is the necropolitic. In Brazil, but basically is the para Bolsonaro is the wonderful form of necropolitic.
Politics, yes.
Yes.
It is very striking. Thank you. That's really important what you have been saying. Similar things do happen in other places, of course. So I would not want to load it all onto Bolsonaro. In Australia, for instance, currently we are in lockdown in Sidney, which is one of the two big cities in Australia where I live. And we are having the worst wave of infection, of COVID infection, that we have had in Australia right now. And it is quite striking that the infections are very strongly concentrated in one region of the city, the southwestern suburbs, which are basically working class suburbs with high proportions of migrant people and a high rate of casualized employment or unemployment. So that that phenomenon of the worst impact of the pandemic being among disadvantaged and marginalized groups is an international pattern. It's in a really bad situation in Brazil, but it is happening elsewhere too. It is a global issue. And it's something that we really have to take a very active response to, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Dulce, do we have another question in the chat? Somehow I lost my chat thread and it seemed like there was one more question there.
No.
No, okay. Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Connell?
Jessica said, thank you. Fabiano has another in the chat. Conselho Bolsonaro, Trump, Putin are near from the marks of an hegemonic masculinity. How these governments reproduce values that feed the pandemic with negationist practices.
That's an interesting issue. One I've thought a little bit about. Clearly, politicians like Trump and Johnson have tried to draw legitimacy from a certain enactment, a certain practice of masculinity. The form of masculinity they have enacted in their politics is not the only contender for the hegemonic position in the, if you like, to put it crudely, the global ruling class. There are other forms of masculinity which also have a degree of power and prestige, such as forms of masculinity oriented to technical knowledge, science, technology, and so on and so forth. I think the version of hegemony that has been claimed by politicians like Trump, Bolsonaro, Johnson, and in a very watered down way, our Prime Minister in Australia, is actually a somewhat risky political direction to take. It can lose legitimacy because of its tendency to produce chaotic policy making and antagonize parts of the population who are very clearly disadvantaged by the policies that emerge from these regimes. It's possible that the pandemic itself may undermine the legitimacy of these political leaders. And in that case, we may see an opening for a different gendering of politics to emerge. I don't see very clear examples of that as yet, but but when I was talking about the possibility of the care workforce becoming a collective actor in gender relations, that is something of like what I had in mind, that initiatives coming from the healthcare workforce could prioritize in a way that actually has a popular impact, could prioritize collective care, mutual care, as the framework of response to the pandemic, in a way that offered a serious alternative to the top-down chaotic authoritarianism that we've seen in many of these regimes so far. I think, if we think of the transition between Trump and Biden in the presidency of the United States, we're looking at two different versions of a hegemonic masculinity. And Biden's version is more like the one I mentioned, that is oriented to technical knowledge and informed long-term policy making. I don't think that the change of one leader creates the world does not change because a particular man is elected to office. But that change may be part of a larger shift that signals possibilities, I guess is what I'm saying. They're not accomplished changes, but they are possible changes now, given pressure from below, given pressure on a much wider social scale than the institutions of American government. We might see a shift in the whole politics of the epidemic. I certainly hope so.
Thank you. Tiago, yeah, you've got your hand up. Tiago.
Fabiano said, thank you, Professor Connell. Thank you very much by your lecture with us tonight. Congratulations by NECOM. Congratulations to NECOM. Tiago has a question. Tiago, please.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you for your speech, Connell. I will try to speak in English, but I'm learning. But I'm learning English. Okay. In Brazil, we have a president, political sexist political. The domestic violence grew up 20% in this pandemic, and the LGBT, the gay community grow up to the violence. So, do you think that in the countries and other countries in development, they had laws, woman laws, to guarantee the protection for the woman to the gay communities? Do you think these countries, I don't know, the free country had another laws to protect the vulnerability, okay, the gay people, yes, and the woman? I'm sorry.
That's all right. You're doing very well. It's very clear what you're saying.
Okay, and I was thinking because in this contest we had some restrictions, but I saw some violence in my family against women. And In Australia, an example, the politicals have laws to protect these communities. I'm sorry, but I try. Thank you very much.
No, that's very clear. I can illustrate this from Australia, which is a federal country. So there are both national laws and state laws. And sometimes that is difficult because they can mismatch. But there are both laws against interpersonal violence, such as domestic violence, what used to be called wife bashing, beating where a man beats a wife. That used to be acceptable. 2 generations ago, that was socially valid. And it was, if it became an issue in the public, it was regarded as a joke, because husbands were supposed to have the right to discipline their wives physically, which mainly meant, beating them up. That is now illegal. There are agencies, public sector agencies, which monitor cases of domestic violence and attempt to do public education campaigns to prevent domestic violence. There are also what we call anti-discrimination laws, which are intended to protect gay and other socially marginalized groups. They are the products of the last 30 or 40 years. Before that time, bashing gays was by no means, it was technically illegal because it was an assault, so it was technically a crime, but it was never prosecuted and was often committed by the police. So the police do not arrest themselves. Within the last generation, there has been a considerable effort to educate the police about domestic violence and homophobic violence. There have been public campaigns against domestic violence, not against homophobic violence. That has not been made a public issue in the same way, which indicates the lesser legitimacy, I suppose, of gay men than married women. But nevertheless, it is at least technically criminal. Now, the big problem about all this is, although we have laws against domestic violence and laws against discrimination against gays and lesbians, the discrimination and the violence still goes on. It has not actually been very much changed by the law. And that has to do with the persistence of the gender order as a whole, which has not been very much changed by legal changes in the last generation. The constructions of masculinity in which many young men are brought up thinking that it is despicable to be gay and admirable to be straight, and the despicable gays deserve any violence that they get. That is still very popular, a very popular belief at all social levels, despite the fact that we had a majority vote in favour of gay marriage in a kind of referendum in Australia. Well over 60% of the whole population voted in favour of gay marriage. So the law was changed, and gay men and lesbians can now marry legally under the same terms as straight people. And that was a remarkable change, which suggested there is a shift in popular attitudes beginning, but which has not yet affected very much the pattern of gender-based violence. So how we deal with that, I mean, there are initiatives going on. There is interest in Australia in the experience of Argentina and Brazil with women's police stations. There are also debates about whether incarceration is a good response to violence anyway, given that prisons are particularly toxic places and incubators of violence as much as they prevent violence, or at least as well as any deterrent role they have. At present, we do not have, I think, a coherent anti-violence strategy, but it's under discussion. It's a very active debate currently going on.
Thank you. Other questions for Dr. Connell?
No, Craig.
I've worn you out.
Well, on behalf of the RC54 committee, I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation, for your time, for your provocations in these areas, really reminding us what our contributions are to the world as sociologists. We really appreciate it, and let's just give you some appreciation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you kindly, and thank you for being with me. As you will have gathered from what I said, although I didn't put this point explicitly, I think the issues that RC54 are dealing with are actually now strategic, are really important for social science as a whole. So more power to your elbows, keep going, and we will have an impact.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
you so much. You are very kindly. We are very happy because we admired so much your work or papers or books. So for us, it's a good opportunity to stay here today. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been good for me too.
Wonderful.
Farewell.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow, guys.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.
The time. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
See you.